You can find the product featured in today's video and so much more at Dan's Dinosaurs. Follow the link in the description below to peruse his expansive selection of all things dinosaur model and figure related. Should you choose to order anything from his site, feel free to mention in the comment box at checkout that your friend Killershrewfan sent you. Now, on to the review. Hello everyone and welcome once again to Nanmu November, and today we'll be taking a look at a couple of figures with a little more bite than our last subjects. It is of course the power couple that is Santiago and Calypso, Nanmu's Baryonyx duo, inspired by the homely Jurassic World Fallen Kingdom critters. Released in the late months of 2021, this unique pair from Nanmu saw the company branching off into fresh territory with their first distinctly diorama-driven release when it comes to their Jurassic designs. Yes, like the old days of Reborn, Nanmu offered up these figures with the intent of allowing collectors to buy one, the other, or both and use them to complete this eye-catching scene you see before you now. And we're gonna talk about each aspect of the display right here and right now on Killershrewfan's Killer Toy Reviews. So let's start by taking a look at the standing Baryonyx. This is the Santiago variant, and it is of course inspired by the design we see in Fallen Kingdom. Now, you may have heard me mention it before, but I'm really not a big fan of the Baryonyx designs from the film. In fact, it's right up there among my least favorite designs from the entire Jurassic saga. And Nanmu appears to have captured that particularly unattractive look here, warts and all. The comically stocky skull for a Spinosaurid, lack of anything resembling a nasal crest, criminally understated eponymous first digit claw, all decked out in the cliched crocodilian scoots. I mean, there's basically nothing about the actual animal that has been preserved here in favor of everything you'd want to see on a generic bipedal crocodile monster. And listen, I'm not one of those guys who looks for accuracy in the Jurassic films, so my distaste for the design doesn't stem from the fact that it's not accurate. But I mean, let's call a spade here. My biggest problem with the design is that it is painfully basic, uninteresting, and just downright ugly. But Killershrewfan, I hear you asking, if you don't like the design, why did you shell out for models of it? And yeah, after all that, you'd think that would immediately cripple any appeal that this offering from Nanmu has going for it, but you would be wrong. I'm not entirely sure what it is they did, but for whatever reason, I do find this to be quite the pleasing representation of the Jurassic design. Maybe it's the dentition, it feels a bit more even than the snaggle-toothed beast we see in the film, and that alone feels like a massive improvement in my book. But regardless of how ugly a design they're basing their work off of, you'll see that the usual level of Nanmu craftsmanship is present on this piece. The aggressively shrink-wrapped skulls have been covered in uneven scales of varying shapes and sizes, and these same scale details can be seen running down the neck and flank of the animal, covering the various folds of skin and flexing muscle tones forming with the specific movement of the model in question. Taking a look at the figure from the top, you can see just how wide the skull of the animal is. And while we're up here, let's look at the backs of the figures, which have been covered in the plated rows of keeled crocodilian scutes, which run from the back of the skull all the way down to the end of that stocky tail. Meanwhile, the ventral region has been covered in rows of rectangular scales, again putting one in mind of a crocodile's underbelly. Moving on to the limbs of the figures, you might start to notice a bit of a pattern here. The forearms and hands boasts the distinct rippled scales we see on the limbs of gators and crocs as we feed down into the not-so-heavy claws of these Baryonyx. I will say, I like the paint on the claws here. The dirty brown is quite nice, and I like how the sheen gives it the appearance of hardened keratin. As for the legs, the muscle tones, particularly in the calves there, have been well captured. You can see all the pulling tendons working in the ankles of the standing version, while the reclining model has a more relaxed look to the sculpt. The usual tarsal and metatarsal scutes have been done on the toes and give way to rectangular scales that run up the shins. Now let's talk about the poses and what each brings to the table. First and foremost, you have the more standard fare from Nanmu, no pun intended there, with the erect figure posed mid-stride on one foot while the head cranes over the right shoulder and mouth opens in a wide roar. Correct me if I'm wrong here, but I do believe this was the first of Nanmu's figures to come with no jaw articulation, a move they seem to be sticking with from here on out. On Santiago here, you can see how the fixed open jaw affords you a look at the fleshy interior of the mouth, from the ribbed palate to the multi-layered yawning throat and long tongue, all done in pinks and purples and glazed over in a high gloss to give you that wet, slobbery look. To tie it all together, the teeth are done in the usual semi-translucent yellowed plastic to really give the mouth a lifelike appearance. When it comes to the rest of the pose, you'll notice that the movement to the flesh has been well rendered to help sell the motion of the animal. The typical folds of skin in the neck, as well as the tension lines and bunches of skin forming with the bracing of the lifting legs, is all there. In all honesty, it's well done, but nothing spectacular, nothing we haven't seen before, and I don't know that such an aggressive and active pose adds a ton to the diorama aspect of this release. Plus, the construction on mine is just completely inefficient. I'm not sure if it's the material in the ankle or the length of the peg on both stands or a mix of both, but this figure just flops right over if you don't have any additional support. You heard me talk about how the paras were a bit gummy on their feet, but this is by far the most unstable of Nanmu's releases that I currently have in my collection. I've actually taken to using a spare PNSO rod just to keep it on its one foot there, but that is a bit of an eyesore against the rest of the diorama, I must say. I really do wish that Nanmu had engineered this just a little bit more carefully. But then we get to the reclining figure, and this one is a bit more tricky to talk about. On one hand, the reclining posture is quite pleasing. The gracile curled up resting position, the movement of the legs against the earth, the swerving lines of skin and sagging of the weight as it settles against the ground. the curled up front limbs, all of that is very well handled, and the execution really sells that look. On the other hand, it is a pretty blatant ripoff of Sarah Wayland Devon's Ceratosaurus. Is it the first time Nanmu has taken quote-unquote inspiration from other models? No, and it's not like their entire business model isn't built off of ripping off designs or anything, but this was perhaps the most flagrant example at the time, a trend we've only seen get worse in 2022. Now, of course, there are only so many poses out there, so some of them are bound to look alike, but the whole reclining on the side while watching a nest with your foot curled up and your arms propping up your chest, that's a pretty distinct design. And as I understand it, it's not actually achievable for dinosaurs despite how pleasing it looks. It'd be one thing if Nanmu did a proper reclining posture. There's only so many ways to do that right. But when it comes to ways to do it wrong, this one is pretty recognizable as someone else's unique work. So yeah, I quite like this pose. The peaceful nature is pretty novel to my collection, and it makes for an interesting juxtaposition against the ugly nature of the design. But I don't know, it just feels a bit dirty to me. Sure, I guess I have no qualms with buying unofficial ripped-off movie designs, but ripping off the work of an independent artist versus a multi-billion-dollar movie studio? That's kind of more of an insult for me. As far as the paint jobs go, you're able to get both sculpts in either the screen-accurate blue color scheme or Nanmu's own yellow design. As far as the movie version goes, you've got the dark blue dorsal and lateral region giving way to a light flank and underbelly with plenty of dry brushing and dark washes to bring out all of that lovely scale detail and skin work. The face then sports a mix of blue and rose colors, and the splashes of teal in the fenestra are present, if maybe just a little bit understated. Meanwhile, Calypso sports more earth tones with a tan underbelly, brown flanks and back, and wine-colored striping. On the back, you'll see bands of mustard yellow that run from the back of the neck to about a quarter of the way down the tail. I will say, I also love the bright blue eyes of this color scheme. Those are quite appealing. So those are the paint jobs. Serviceable enough, but I do think the application is a bit wanting in places. At least on my copies it is. When it comes to Santiago, I can't help but feel that some of the dry brushing, particularly around the face, is a bit caked on, like bad makeup or something. Then the stripe that separates the two body tones just looks like a squiggly line drawn on using some pastels, particularly on the legs there. Does that not look like a child's crayon or something? I think as a whole, Calypso fares better in regards to coming across looking more naturalistic in the paint, but the yellow markings on the back do feel a bit heavy-handed and look a bit like spilled mustard splatters. Of course, these paint jobs are still quite strong for a mass-produced figure, but by Nanmu standards, they're leaving me a little cold. Plus, instead of just doing two variants, it might have been cool to see them do a take on Limbo and Grim from Camp Cretaceous. We all know how fond Nanmu is of their repaints, and I might have liked to have all three sisters on my shelf, but c'est la vie, money saved. But then we get to the real draw of this set, and probably the only reason I could be swayed to buy two of these monstrosities. It's the diorama aspect. Purchasing the two together also gets you this massive slab of a base featuring a layered cracked earth appearance and completed with a nest of 6 oblong speckled eggs. Not only does this base allow you to create an entire scene within your Nanmu display, but it also works great with a variety of figures in your collection, giving it a multi-purpose edge. Unfortunately, if you're gonna get this base, you do have to shell out for one of each. I don't know, maybe it would have been nice to have 2 of Calypso's color schemes or 2 of Santiago's color schemes for this set, but like I said, you would have had to get them both together, and then if you wanted a second of either version to replace either or with, you have to shell out for that one separately. I'm almost tempted to get a reclining Santiago, but we'll see. When it comes to setting these guys up, Santiago pegs right in there, and then Calypso can be placed with her foot against the mound of eggs, giving this great image of a watchful, brooding specimen. You can display them together or separately, creating a peaceful scene of a reclining parent or a tense standoff between an angry nesting baryonyx and unseen threat. You do also get this unpainted gar prey item that can be added to the display, perhaps as food brought back to the mate keeping watch over the eggs, only to have the meal interrupted by some encroaching adversary, which Santiago here is preparing to fend off. Of course, if you opted to just purchase the standing figure, it does come with its own small base, perhaps a little too small to work as a counterbalance, but that's besides the point. You can see the same cracked earth finish as on the larger base, and then both of the bottoms have been finished in a black plastic with the Nanmu logo. Let's get into some measurements. The standing model comes in at just past 9.5 inches or 24 centimeters in a straight measurement, and just over 4.5 inches or around 11.5 centimeters off the ground when on the base. Meanwhile, the reclining version measures in at around 9 inches long or just under 23 centimeters, and then measures just under 3 inches off the ground or around 7.5 centimeters. Of course, these figures are the exact same model, just posed differently, and if you measured along the curves of the body, you'd get something closer to 11 inches in length, or just around 28 centimeters. According to the DPG promotional material for Fallen Kingdom, the Baryonyx was about 30.5 feet, which would put these figures at about 1/33 scale. Now for some size comparisons. I'll start by bringing in some Fallen Kingdom contemporaries. First we have Nanmu's original Carnotaurus, which was actually the very first Nanmu figure I ever got, and it's just been a downward spiral out of control from there. But anywho, you'll notice that these two are pretty similar in terms of the length, but Santiago does stand a bit taller. I also think when it comes to the paintwork, these Baryonyx are a bit closer to being in line with Ranger here, which isn't necessarily a compliment given how far Nanmu have come since their early days. I'll be interested to see how they stack up against their new Carnotaurus, which just shipped out recently. Next up, here are Santiago and Calypso with Nanmu's Allosaurus blade. These two have a bit of a unique connection, seeing how a one-armed juvenile Baryonyx not only fought a young Allosaurus in Dominion, but also apparently won, seeing as it was still around after the fight to eat the generic redneck bad guy that Wikipedia tells me was apparently named Rain. Then of course, have to do a T-Rex comparison. Here are the Baryonyx duo with Nanmu's Buck Rex, the once and future king. And as a final Nanmu dinosaur comparison, here are Santiago and Calypso with the original Spinosaurus supplanter. And honestly, I think they look a little big next to him. Something to be said for their re-releases, I guess. And now for something completely different. Here's Nanmu's Baryonyx figure next to PNSO's Sinopliosaurus, I mean the Siamosaurus, Suko... I don't know, whatever the heck we all decided to call this thing. And even if this isn't exactly an accurate Baryonyx, it certainly makes for a more interesting design that I would have loved to see on the big screen in place of Lyle Crocodile here. And finally, if you want to see these guys next to a real Baryonyx, well, the closest I currently have at my disposal is the Favorite co-offering. Certainly not a perfect representation, it suffers the same crocodilian scoots that saddle the movie design, but you can still see just how different these two are morphologically, and how much more interesting the real animal looks in comparison. God, I wish the original artwork for Baryonyx in Jurassic World was used. Ugh. And finally, what would a Nanmu review be without our good friend Chris Pratt showing up? And it seems as though he's found himself in a whole nest of trouble here. Thank goodness for that hand trick. And that was Nanmu's Baryonyx duo. Overall, I have to give Nanmu credit. They took a bad design and managed to make it look somewhat appealing in model form, and the whole diorama aspect was a great way to add some life and character to an otherwise simple reproduction of a painfully generic design. That being said, without the display aspect playing into it, I do find the two to be a bit lacking in the technical department. To be fair, the sculpt is still pretty strong, but we've at least certainly seen better paint from Nanmu in the past, and especially nowadays. Maybe it's not entirely their fault. Like I said, they're working off a lacking design here to begin with, and the fact that they made something even this good is commendable, but I don't know, it's certainly not my favorite release from the company. The diorama aspect is what saves it. But if you're not willing to shell out for the full set, heck, I don't even know if this whole set thing is still available. I know Nanmu's production runs are usually pretty short, but if you're not willing to go the full mile with it, I would recommend either getting the reclining offering for something different or just skipping it entirely. I originally was planning to get the standing blue version just for something that would interact a little better with all the other models in my collection, but if I had to do it all over again and I missed out on the diorama aspect, I would probably just get the reclining blue version just so I had something from the films that was on my shelf but still different. But as always, I want to know what you guys think of this set. Do you own either of these Baryonyx? Which is your favorite and why? Do you agree with me that the Baryonyx design in the film is ugly as sin, or are you very into it? Okay, once I start making puns, that's a sign it's time to stop the video. So be sure to drop a comment down below, and as always, thank you all so much for tuning in to today's episode of Nanmu November. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you're all ready to think a little bigger for the next one. Until then though, take care out there, and bye-bye.